Family is the safest place? That's a lie. Safety has a sound, the clean click of a lock sliding home, and our front door hadn't made that sound in years. It rasped and hung crooked, a brass tongue of a deadbolt that never quite caught, the way their words never quite called me by my name. "You're dead weight that eat but don't help," Aunt Mila said, and the others didn't argue. They only watched my mouth like it was stealing air they'd paid for. Morning made the kitchen look honest. Stained light through the thin curtains, a line of ants nosing a sugar spill to the wall, the chipped blue bowl at my place because no one else wanted to see it. I moved quietly, the way you learn to move when every sound is a verdict. The kettle hissed, then squealed, and Uncle pressed his palm flat on the table as if he could quiet the whole room by pinning it down. "You hear me?" he asked, though he hadn't asked anything at all. I nodded anyway. People like answers more than silence, even when they deserve the silence. They had a rhythm to it. First, the sigh like a warning bell. Then the litany: rent you didn't pay, I had. Chores you didn't do, I did. Gratitude you didn't show. I learned to make it invisible because visible gratitude made them suspicious. They talked about me as if I weren't in the room, and when I looked up, they looked at each other, a relay race of eyes. It was the only sport we played together. "You eat and you sleep and you take," Cousin Danny said, and set her fork down with a neat little ping that sounded like a judgment gavel. "What do you give?" I could have said receipts. I could have said my 2 jobs, my nights, my throat. I could have said the rent was in my name because theirs was ruined, that the utilities ran through my account because mine was the only one without red stamps. I could have said the mortgage company called me, not them. But truth in that kitchen only made new doors for anger to walk through. I rinsed my cup. The water had a metallic taste. The window above the sink had a wobbly patch of glass where a baseball had gone through years ago, sealed with clear glue that dried cloudy. In the blur, the yard looked like a painting left in the rain. I thought of the key in my pocket, warm from my palm. I'd started carrying it at night because the lock stuck, and sometimes after late shifts the door fought me like a person. Keys are small gods when the house is a skeptic. "Say thank you," Aunt Mila said, the way some people say grace. "For what?" The words came out with no ornament, flat, light enough to float or sink depending on who was listening. She stared at me like I'd broken a rule I should have read at birth. She reached across the table and turned my empty plate, as if an answer might be written underneath. There was only a scratch where the glaze had worn thin. "For breathing under a roof you didn't build," she said. Uncle laughed in that short, sharp way that's mostly air. "She wouldn't know a hammer if it hit her," he added. I pictured the receipts again like a card trick I could do with my eyes closed. The bank statements, the automated emails, the reminder to call Ms. Hart in escrow, paper hammers, quiet nails. I tried to leave it there. I stacked the bowls, wiped the table, bent to pick up the fork someone had nudged off with a knee. When I straightened, Danny's phone was angled at me. Not recording, just watching, an extra eye. The screen made me look pale and faceless, like a ghost haunting a family that didn't believe in ghosts. "Stop creeping around," she said. "It's weird." I placed the fork in the sink like I was putting a child to bed. "I'm going to work," I said. "You'll come back late, so we have to hear you," Uncle answered. "Your noise, your cost." The word cost had a weight to it I felt in the back of my teeth. At the doorway, the broken lock scraped my knuckles again. A thin red line rose like a signature I hadn't agreed to. Outside, the air had that mid-week, mid-month tiredness. Trash cans still at the curb, 2 houses with curtains pinned open by clothespins, the neighbor girl chalking a sun on the sidewalk with gray chalk, turning it into a moon because the bright sticks were gone. I took 3 steps onto the porch and stopped. The old for sale sign lay face down behind the hedges, the one we never took apart after the first time the bank had flirted with us. I could see the stapled pocket where the brochures used to go. Empty. The emptiness felt like a suggestion. Pattern-set hours carry you like a conveyor belt until a small thing jams the teeth. Mine was the county envelope in the mailbox, thick with the confidence of things that don't ask. I slid a finger under the seal, careful not to tear the return address, careful the way you get when information looks back at you. Inside, notice of reassessment, a map of our block as a pale tangle of rectangles and numbers, and a short paragraph that said, "If you have questions, call this number." I knew the number. I'd saved it under a bland contact name. Heart Office. Neutral words travel far. I folded the papers and put them next to the key. Metal, paper, 2 kinds of authority that felt nothing. Behind me, the door opened a hand's width. "What are you doing?" Danny asked. Her voice had sugar only when it had an audience. Today it had been rinsed clean. "Mail," I said. "That yours?" "It's addressed to the owner." "And who's that?" She smiled like the joke was about to land. I didn't answer. I heard Aunt's step behind her and the scent of her hand cream, something floral that pretended to be gentle. "If you have to ask, it's not you," Aunt said. "Now move, you're blocking the light." They went back in, and the door didn't latch. It hung with that open-mouthed look houses get when they don't care who comes or goes. I pressed the door until I felt the tongue click once, then twice, testing faith. It held. A neighbor's dog barked. A bus sighed at the corner. The sun caught on the chrome of the mailbox and flashed. A camera with no memory. I stood very still and listened to the quiet sound a decision makes before it's a decision. The soft organizing of what you know, the stack of papers aligning, the key rotating in an invisible lock in your head. I slid the reassessment notice deeper into my bag, tucked the key beside it, and walked down the steps without looking back. The rain hadn't stopped since that night, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the words still echoing in my chest. Dead weight. The suitcase was heavier than it should have been, though I'd only packed a few dresses, the old sewing kit, and the cracked frame with my grandmother's picture inside. The house, their house, stood behind me, its windows glowing with the same warmth I'd once believed meant safety. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't cry. I only left the key on the table, next to a note they'd never read, because they didn't really see me anymore. Maybe they never had. The streetlight flickered above me as I dragged the suitcase across the uneven pavement. Every stone seemed to catch on the wheels, as if the ground itself tried to hold me back. But I kept moving. Not toward the bus station, no. I couldn't stay in this town where every face knew mine, where every whisper would ask why the granddaughter left her own blood. Instead, I walked to the lawyer's office 2 streets over. He was an old friend of my grandfather's, a man with eyes that had seen too many promises broken. His voice didn't ask why. It only asked for the papers. By dawn, the house was no longer theirs. It was mine. And by dusk, it was no longer mine either. The sale happened fast, too fast maybe, but the ache in my stomach told me it was the only way. I'd grown up inside those walls, where the wallpaper peeled but the stories held me tighter than the plaster ever could. My grandmother's voice had once filled every corner, lullabies that smelled like cinnamon, tales of girls who refused to bow, hands that stitched dresses out of scraps but made them shine brighter than silk. And now her voice was gone, replaced by sharp tongues and heavy silences, until even the air felt poisoned. Selling the house wasn't revenge. It was release. a key turning not in a door, but inside my chest. When the buyer handed me the envelope of money, I didn't count it. I didn't need to. I felt the weight of it press against my palm like a promise. Survival. My first step into a world where I owed nothing to anyone who had called me useless. But the world outside wasn't kind. The landlord who rented me a narrow room above a mechanic's shop warned me not to make noise after 9 p.m. The walls smelled of oil and rust, and the single window faced a brick wall that swallowed light whole. Still, I taped my grandmother's picture above the bed. Her eyes, caught in a frozen smile, seemed to ask if I was ready. I whispered that I was, even if my hands shook as I unpacked. Even if loneliness clawed at me in the dark, work became my shield. At the bakery, I kneaded dough until my fingers cramped, wiped flour from my face, and smiled at customers who never looked twice at me. At night, I stitched buttons for a tailor who underpaid me but gave me thread for free. I lived between exhaustion and silence, always saving, always hiding the envelope of bills under the loose floorboard by my bed. I told myself this was temporary. That survival was the first step, not the last. But survival has a way of stretching into years if you let it. And sometimes, when the neon sign of the garage below flickered and buzzed, I thought of the house. Not the cruelty inside it, but the sound of my grandmother's voice echoing down the hallway, her words like a lantern on stormy nights. Stand tall, even when you feel small. I clung to that memory like a thread through a needle, pulling myself forward stitch by stitch, even as the fabric of my life threatened to tear. The city never slept, but it also never listened. Its streets buzzed with engines and sirens, voices tangled together until no single cry could be heard. That suited them, my family, because their cruelty had always depended on silence. Here, in this new place, I was just another stranger with flour on her sleeves and tired eyes. But silence follows you when it's trained into your bones. I learned not to speak too loud, not to claim too much space. Invisible, that was the safest way. At the bakery, the other girls laughed in clusters, trading gossip like candy. I kept to the mixing table, where dough rose and fell like shallow breaths. "Why don't you ever say anything?" one of them asked, her lipstick bright as a wound. I shrugged. Easier than explaining that words were dangerous in my old house, that every sentence had been weighed like a coin and found worthless. They called me Quiet Girl, a name that stuck harmless enough until the whispers started. She thinks she's better than us. Silence becomes arrogance in other people's mouths. Neighbors weren't kinder. The landlady, Mrs. Clark, never missed a chance to remind me how fragile my position was. "Rent is due on the 1st," she'd say, even when I'd handed her the envelope days earlier. She watched me through the hall window like a cat watches a bird cage. Once, when I lingered by the mailboxes, she muttered to another tenant, "These girls come and go. They don't last." I wanted to tell her I'd lasted more than she could imagine, that I'd walked out of a house that ate me alive and still had the strength to carry a key. But I didn't. I let her think silence was agreement. The first real wound came one Sunday afternoon. I'd taken a seat in the back pew of the church, more for warmth than faith. The priest spoke of family as a sanctuary, his words sweet and heavy as syrup. "Home," he said, "is where love waits at the door." My throat burned. Behind me, 2 women whispered, "Isn't that the girl who sold her own family's house?" Their voices slithered like smoke. I heard she stole it, took money that wasn't hers. I clenched my hands in my lap, nails biting into skin, and stared at the stained glass until the colors blurred. The sermon went on, but I only heard the echo of my aunt's voice. Dead weight, cost. The world outside hadn't saved me. It had simply learned a new language to wound me with. That night, in the room above the mechanic's shop, I sat by the window staring at the brick wall. A faint hum of jazz spilled from somewhere down the street. My grandmother's picture watched me with that same patient smile, as if waiting for me to prove her right. I whispered to her, as I often did, "I'm still standing. Isn't that enough?" But the silence in the room answered back, heavier than any voice. Standing is not the same as living. I folded the sermon leaflet, tucked it beneath the loose floorboard with the money, and touched the old key still hidden in my pocket. Cold metal against skin. Proof that I hadn't been erased, no matter what they said. Proof that silence one day could become something louder. The crack came at dinner, not mine, their plates. It was a Tuesday evening, the bakery had closed late, and I'd rushed home with flour still under my fingernails. The hallway smelled of fried onions and damp coats. Mrs. Clark's nephew had decided to invite his friends, and the air upstairs was thick with laughter and the clatter of forks against porcelain. I passed their door quickly, but even through the thin wood I caught it. She's the one, right? The quiet girl. Looks like she eats more than she earns. The table erupted. A sound like glass shattering followed. Maybe a dropped dish. Maybe just my imagination filling the silence between their words. I didn't stop. I walked on, head down, but the echo followed me into my own room. I set the key on the nightstand, then the envelope of money beside it, as if those objects alone could argue my worth. But objects can't speak. People can. And people choose cruelty too often. Later that week, I returned home early, exhausted from stitching until my fingertips bled faint red dots onto the fabric. I pushed open the door to my room and froze. The picture of my grandmother had been knocked to the floor, the frame cracked clean across her face. The loose board under my bed gaped open, as though someone had pried it with a knife. The money was still there, thank God, but it wasn't untouched. The bills were shuffled, creased differently, as if counted by foreign hands. I gathered the photograph, held the two halves together, and whispered an apology. To her, to myself. Rage pressed against my ribs, but it had nowhere to go. In my old house, they'd accused me of being nothing. Here, strangers broke into my small sanctuary just to remind me that I was still nothing. That night, I sat at the desk with only a candle burning. Its light danced against the cracked glass of the frame, splitting my grandmother's eyes into two fragments, one calm, one sorrowful. The mirror above the sink caught the flame too, but its surface was spidered with lines, each fracture turning my reflection into a puzzle of broken faces. And there it was, the first clear fracture in me. Not the silence, not the whispers, but this moment when the world reached into my tiny corner and snapped something fragile. I pressed the key into my palm until the teeth dug into skin, until I felt the sting sharp enough to remind me I was still whole. But outside the laughter began again. Forks, plates, glasses, the music of people who belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was cruel. I blew out the candle and the room sank into darkness. Fractured mirror still grinning back at me, daring me to find a new face. The house felt lighter the day he died. Not mine, theirs. It was an uncle, the loudest voice in that kitchen chorus, the one who always pressed his hand flat on the table as though the wood itself could silence me. Word came through a neighbor, heart attack, sudden, in the middle of supper. For a moment I thought silence might finally be on my side, that maybe, without him, the house would soften. That cruelty could fade like smoke after a fire, but cruelty doesn't vanish, it shifts. His chair wasn't empty for long. My aunt slid into it like a queen reclaiming a throne, and the others, Cousins, neighbors, even the priest spoke of her strength, her sacrifice, her burden. No one asked about mine. No one remembered the nights I carried the bills, the mornings I baked bread until my wrists ached, the hours I kept the roof from collapsing by signing papers in my name. They did remember me when it suited them. A letter arrived, heavy with their handwriting, perfumed faintly with the smell of the old kitchen. "Family must come together now," it read. "We expect you to help. No apology, no admission, just expectation wrapped in ink." I folded it carefully, slid it under the floorboard beside the money, and stared at the key in my palm. The teeth of it gleamed in the dim light, sharp as a question. Help or leave them to their own silence? I went back once, not inside, never again inside, but to the street where the house stood. Curtains drawn, paint peeling more than before. The for sale sign gone, the yard trimmed by strangers. My grandmother's rose bush, once wild and defiant, hacked to a stump. I stood across the road and wondered if the walls still remembered her songs, or if they only echoed with the new owner's footsteps. When a cousin spotted me, she crossed the street with eyes like knives. "You sold us out," she hissed. Her voice was sharp enough that a neighbor turned to watch. I wanted to say I'd saved myself, that no one asked about the nights I slept cold because the heater broke, or the mornings I went hungry so the light stayed on. Instead, I said nothing. Silence is safer than truth. She spat at my shoes and walked away, leaving me standing on pavement that once felt like home. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother again. Not singing, not smiling, just standing at the end of a hallway, her face split by the same crack that cut her picture frame. She held out her hand, but in her palm was not comfort. It was the key. The same one I clenched every night, the same one that had outlived her voice, her stories, her house. I woke with its cold weight against my chest, and I understood. Sometimes the dead leave you nothing but choices. The rain had stopped, but the street was still slick with mud the night they threw my things outside. I came back from the bakery carrying a bag of bread ends, what was left after the customers had taken the best pieces, only to find my suitcase open on the pavement, my dresses damp and scattered like fallen leaves. The photograph of my grandmother lay face down in the dirt, the glass frame shattered completely now. And on top of it all, like a crown of mockery, sat the sewing kit. Its lid snapped, spools of thread spilling into puddles, unraveling in the gutter. "Rent late," Mrs. Clark's nephew shouted from the window above, though he knew it wasn't true. The landlady herself never came down, only let him sneer for her. "We don't need strays here. Go back to wherever you came from." His laughter dripped down the wall like grease. A few neighbors watched from their porches, their silence louder than his jeers. No one lifted a hand. No one said a word. I knelt in the street, gathering what I could. My fingers shook as I picked up the pieces, threading the photograph back together in my mind. Every dress I stuffed into the bag felt like a reminder. They can take anything if you don't hold it close enough. That's when I saw it, the key. Not to this rented room, not to any place I could sleep that night, but the old house key, heavy, rusted at the edges, warm from my pocket. I pressed it into my palm until the teeth carved half-moons into my skin. For the first time, I didn't see it as a reminder of loss. I saw it as a promise, small and sharp. A door could be closed as well as opened. I left the broken frame in the gutter. I couldn't carry it anymore. Instead, I tucked the key under my collar, close enough to feel its cold bite against my chest. The laughter from the window followed me down the street, but it didn't echo as deep this time. Something had shifted, something solid had formed where silence used to be, At the train station, I sat with the bag of damp clothes at my feet and the bread pressed against my knees. The ticket counter was closed for the night, and I didn't have a destination anyway. But the benches were warm from the bodies of travelers who had come before me, and the sound of trains rattling the tracks felt steadier than any lullaby I'd ever known. I held the key in my hand and whispered to myself, not dead weight, not cost, not silence. The words were shaky, but they were mine. And in the dim light of the station, that felt like enough to keep breathing until morning. The benches at the station were made of iron, cold enough that the chill seeped straight through my coat. I curled against the armrest with my bag clutched to my chest and listened to the trains sigh, in and out, metal on metal, like lungs too weary to keep breathing. Around me, the waiting room was the gallery of the forgotten. A man asleep with his hat pulled low, a mother rocking her child against her breastbone, a soldier staring at the timetable as if numbers might change out of pity. None of them looked at me. That was its own kind of mercy. The clerk's window was shuttered, but a stack of tickets lay inside, pale slips of escape. I imagined one in my hand. Creased, stamped, permission to leave this town and its poison behind. The thought of boarding a train and vanishing into another city where no one knew my name sent a tremor through me. But the money stayed buried in the floorboard of a room I no longer had. All I had tonight was the key, warm in my palm, and the bread pressed against my ribs. A janitor passed through with a mop and bucket. He glanced at me, then away, as if poverty were contagious. His silence wasn't cruel, it was worse. Indifference. That's how the world swallowed people like me, not with teeth, but with shrugs. I pressed the key harder into my hand until its teeth left little stars of pain, tiny constellations no one else could see. Midnight came. The soldier left, the mother dozed, the hat slumped further over the man's face. The station grew quieter, but my mind did not. It replayed every word from that kitchen, every hissed whisper from the neighbors, every crack in the mirror that refused to show me whole. My grandmother's face flickered in memory, smiling, but the crack down her photograph always followed. Stand tall, she had said in her stories. I sat straighter, spine aching, and stared at the rails gleaming faintly beyond the window. A train thundered past without stopping, its windows full of strangers, their faces lit by yellow lamps. For a second, I imagined one of those seats was mine. For a second, I believed I could step onto a platform somewhere else and feel new air in my lungs. Then the roar faded, the lamps disappeared, and the silence returned heavier than before. I curled tighter against the bench. The bread was hard now, the crust digging into my arms. I closed my eyes, telling myself that if I slept, maybe the morning would give me a ticket. Maybe the key in my hand was not just a relic, but a promise. But even as sleep tugged at me, the last thought in my mind was not of leaving. It was of the faces I'd left behind, still sitting at that table, still calling me nothing, and the ache of wondering if silence would ever be enough to answer them. By the second week, my silence had grown its own mouth. It spoke for me in corners I never entered, in voices I never heard directly. At the bakery, the girls no longer called me quiet. Now they called me strange. One morning, I overheard two of them whispering near the flour sacks. "She sold her family's house," one said, her tone sharp as a bread knife. "Kicked them out on the street." The other laughed, shaking sugar over the countertop. "No wonder she doesn't talk. Guilty conscience." They didn't see me standing in the doorway, dough drying on my hands. I wanted to shout the truth, to empty my chest of every receipt, every bill, every sleepless night. Instead, I carried the trays out front and let their words trail behind me like smoke. The rumors spread faster than the bread baked. At the corner store, two women turned their backs when I entered. At church, the pew beside me stayed empty, though the rest were full. One boy shouted from across the street, "That's the thief!" His friends laughed until the sound bounced off the houses and filled the air with echoes. No one corrected him, no one stopped them. The silence of the crowd was worse than the jeers. I began to walk with my head lower, shoulders bent, as though bracing against a storm only I could feel. But storms make noise. This was different, an invisible weather, the kind that seeps into your bones and convinces you the air itself has turned against you. One evening, as I left the tailor's shop with a bundle of mended shirts, a neighbor stepped out of her doorway. She held a broom like a staff and blocked the path. "You think we don't know what you did?" she hissed. Her eyes glittered with satisfaction, as though cruelty was a prize. Dead weight doesn't change just because it runs. I froze. Behind her, two children peeked around the doorframe, wide-eyed, memorizing the lesson. Silence is guilt. Survival is theft. I wanted to ask her if she remembered the bills I paid, the nights I worked while her own light stayed bright, but my throat locked. The shirt slipped from my arms, scattering across the dirt. She didn't help pick them up. Neither did the children. Back in my room above the mechanic's shop, I stitched until my fingers throbbed. Each prick of the needle felt like punishment, a small confession offered to no one. When I finally stopped, I reached under the floorboard for the envelope, counted the bills, and laid the key beside them. Cold metal, warm paper, the only truths that hadn't betrayed me. Yet even as I tried to sleep, the neighbor's voice followed me. Dead weight doesn't change. It coiled around the silence of the city until I could no longer tell the difference between their cruelty and my own doubts. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of gray morning when the air felt damp even without rain. I was leaving the bakery with a paper bag of bread scraps, head down, when someone called out. Not sharp, not mocking, just steady. "Miss," he said. I froze. Strangers rarely spoke to me unless it was to remind me of what they thought I'd done. I turned slowly. A man stood by the church steps, holding a bundle of books against his chest. His coat was worn at the elbows, his shoes dusted with chalk from the schoolhouse nearby. A teacher, I guessed. His eyes were not curious, not cruel, only observant. The way people look at puzzles they mean to solve gently. "You dropped this," he added, lifting the corner of my apron where a scrap of thread had snagged. He freed it carefully, as though fabric deserved the same dignity as flesh. I whispered a thank you, the word rough from disuse. He nodded but didn't walk away. "You're the girl everyone talks about," he said, matter of fact, no venom. My stomach tightened, bracing for the familiar sting. Then he added, "They're wrong?" The word startled me more than any insult had. Wrong? No one had said that before. Not once. I stared, waiting for the catch, but he only shifted his books and continued. "People repeat what they don't understand. It's easier than asking." We stood in silence. This time it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space being held open, wide enough for breath. "Come by the school sometime," he said at last. "We always need someone who knows how to stitch. The children tear their uniforms faster than I can patch them." His smile was small, tired but real. Then he walked away, his figure swallowed by the morning crowd. That evening, as I sat in my narrow room, I replayed his words again and again. They're wrong. Simple, but heavier than any accusation. For the first time, the key in my pocket felt less like a burden and more like a possibility, something that might unlock more than doors, something that might prove silence wasn't the only language I had left. I pressed it against the photo of my grandmother, now taped clumsily back together. Her cracked smile seemed steadier beneath the metal's weight. For the first time in years, I whispered not an apology, but a question. What if I'm more than what they said? And for the first time, the silence didn't argue back. The school smelled of chalk and ink, faintly sweet like old paper left in the sun. When I stepped inside, the floor creaked as if announcing me, but no one turned to stare. Children's voices carried down the hall, bright and unfiltered, a sound so unlike the whispers that had shadowed me everywhere else. The teacher, Mr. Lane, I learned, met me at the doorway to his classroom. He didn't make a speech or ask for proof of who I was. He only handed me a stack of uniforms, buttons dangling like loose teeth. "If you've got time," he said. His trust was simple, unearned, and it caught me off guard. I stitched in the corner while the children recited lessons, their voices rising and falling like waves. Some glanced at me, curious, but then returned to their books. They didn't point, didn't whisper. When one boy ripped his sleeve on a desk splinter, he came straight to me, holding it out without a word. I patched it quickly, my fingers moving the way my grandmother had taught me, the way that used to earn only criticism at home. The boy grinned, wide and gap-toothed, before racing back to his seat. The smile lingered in the air long after he'd gone. At the end of the day, Mr. Lane pressed a coin into my palm. "Not much," he said, "but honest." The coin was warm from his hand. I stared at it longer than I should have, because it wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that my work could be valued without being twisted, that my silence wasn't always a debt. That evening, I carried bread home from the bakery, coins in my pocket, and for once the walk felt lighter. The neighbors still looked through me, but their silence no longer crushed. It slid past like water against stone. Upstairs in my narrow room, I placed the coin under the loose board beside the envelope of bills. The key lay next to it, cold and constant, but for the first time it didn't feel like my only anchor. I boiled a pot of soup that night, thin, with more water than vegetables, but it filled the air with warmth. As I ate, I caught myself humming, low and uncertain, a scrap of melody my grandmother used to sing when the night stretched long. It startled me, the sound of my own voice, but I didn't stop. For the first time in years, I felt something shift. Not freedom, not yet, but the faint shape of it forming like a doorway in the dark. The letter came folded so neatly it looked harmless, like a pressed flower. The handwriting was unmistakable, my aunt's, sharp and slanted, every line cutting across the page as though even ink obeyed her. "Family needs you," it began. "The house feels empty without you. We've all said things we regret. It's time to come back." For a moment, my chest opened like a door. Could it be true? After months of silence, of spit on my shoes and whispers in church, had they finally remembered I was blood? I read the lines again and again until the words blurred. Empty without me. Regret. Come back. My grandmother's photograph watched from the shelf, the crack across her face now covered with tape. I touched the key in my pocket, warm from my skin, and wondered if maybe it was pointing me home instead of away. I walked to the edge of their street the next day, heart thundering in my throat. The house stood there, same peeling paint, same drooping gutter. Curtains drawn, but a lamp glowed faintly inside. I imagined stepping over that threshold, imagined forgiveness wrapped around me like a shawl. Then the door opened. My cousin Danny stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, her voice slicing through the evening air. "Yeah, we just need her signature. She still has the papers, right?" "No, she'll do it. She's desperate enough." She laughed, sharp and dry, and flicked her cigarette into the yard. The words landed heavier than any insult had. Not love, not regret, just need, just paperwork, just another way to use me. I turned before she could see me, walked fast, almost ran, until the glow of the house was gone behind me. My hand clutched the key so tightly its teeth bit into my palm, blood rising in half-moon shapes. This time I didn't loosen my grip. Pain was cleaner than hope. Back in my room, I unfolded the letter one last time. The words that had once shimmered with promise now looked hollow, printed on lies instead of paper. I burned it in the small pan I use for cooking, watched the ash curl like dead leaves. The smoke filled the room, bitter and sharp, but it cleared something inside me. When the flame died, I slid the key across the table. Not a relic, not a chain, a decision waiting to be made. The apartment was small, barely more than a room with a stove in the corner and a window that opened onto a streetlight instead of the sun. But when I turned the lock that first night, the sound was clean. Final. The door shut behind me and stayed shut because I had willed it. No one could force it open, no one could spit accusations through the frame. It was my door, my key, my silence. I unpacked slowly, dresses folded into the crooked drawers, sewing kit set carefully on the counter, the envelope of money tucked beneath a loose tile by the stove. The cracked photograph of my grandmother went on the windowsill. Her face was split, taped together, but the smile endured. I placed a single glass of water beside her, the closest thing I had to a ritual. The first night I boiled soup from scraps, carrots gone soft, bones bought cheap from the butcher. The steam filled the room, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to listen for footsteps behind me, didn't have to brace for voices telling me I'd done it wrong. I ate slowly, spoon by spoon, and the silence tasted almost sweet. The next morning I bought flowers from a cart on the corner, yellow ones, bright as defiance. The seller wrapped them in paper that still smelled of ink, yesterday's news clinking to today's joy. I set them on the windowsill beside my grandmother's photograph. The petals caught the light from the street lamp, turning it into a softer glow. A room with a lamp and flowers felt like something I could almost call home. Work followed the same rhythm. The bakery, the tailor, afternoons at the school patching uniforms. Coins gathered in my pocket, and for once they didn't vanish into someone else's needs. At night, I stitched my own dress, each seam neat, each button tight, as if proving to myself I could hold things together. Neighbors came and went in the hallway. Some nodded, some ignored me. None whispered my name. That absence of poison was its own gift. In their silence, I felt invisible, but now invisibility was safety, not shame. On the third evening, as I locked the door and slid the key into my pocket, I realized something small but certain. This was not survival anymore. This was living, fragile and unsteady, but mine. The house I'd lost had never been safe, never been home. But here, in a single room with flowers and soup and silence that didn't hurt, I had found the first true corner of belonging. It happened on a market day, when the square swelled with voices and the smell of roasted chestnuts clung to the cold air. I was carrying a basket of bread back to my apartment when I saw them. My aunt, shoulders bent but eyes still sharp. Danny, older now, her laughter thinner, forced. Two younger cousins trailing behind, clutching bags of secondhand clothes. They didn't see me at first. I froze near a stall of apples, the red skins glowing like coals. The sight of them tightened something in my chest. A cord pulled too suddenly. Their faces were harder, lined by strain. The house I'd sold had not sheltered them. Word on the street was they rented a place half the size, with leaking pipes and a landlord colder than Mrs. Clark. Watching them bargain over bruised fruit, I felt an ache I hadn't prepared for. Not triumph, not revenge, something closer to grief. Danny's voice cut through the square, still sharp, but no longer triumphant. 3 coins for this? It's rotten. The seller shrugged. Her words bounced off the walls, loud enough to make passers-by turn. And just like before, the crowd did nothing. No laughter this time, only silence. But silence still weighed. I slipped into an alley, back pressed against stone, breath shallow. My hand found the key in my pocket. I hadn't touched it in weeks, but now it pressed against my palm with the same heavy question. What do you owe to the people who once called you nothing? I imagined walking up to them, pressing the key into my aunt's hand, telling her the truth, that the house had been mine to sell, that I'd carried their debts, their shame, their silence, that they lived where they did because I had chosen survival over obedience. Would it free me? Or chain me again? Instead, I stood in the shadow and watched as they walked away, their bags heavy, their backs bent. The key dug into my skin, a cold reminder. Forgiveness or truth, mercy or justice. I didn't know which one I had the strength to give. That night, I laid the key on the table beside the flowers, now wilted, their petals soft as paper. My grandmother's photograph leaned against the glass, the crack across her smile more visible than ever. I whispered into the silence, "What would you have me do?" But the silence gave no answer, only the weight of the key, waiting, daring me to choose. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. I sat at the table with the key in one hand and the photograph in the other. The flowers had wilted, the soup pot was empty, but the silence around me was steady, unbroken. In the window's reflection, I saw 2 faces. Mine, lined by all the years of swallowing words, and my grandmother's, taped back together but still smiling. Between us, the key gleamed faintly under the lamp. A question, not an answer. I could return it, hand it back to the people who had called me nothing. I could tell them the truth, let the weight of my choices fall where it belonged. Or I could let the key remain with me, not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as proof that survival had carved me into someone new. Forgiveness or truth, mercy or justice, a lie that makes peace or a truth that breaks it. I lifted the key, pressed it against my palm until it left its teeth in my skin. Then I looked at the photograph, at the taped smile that had outlived cruelty. "I'm still standing," I whispered. "But what does standing mean if I can't choose how to end this?" The silence answered with its usual patience. It always left the choice to me, and maybe, now, to you. Would you choose forgiveness or truth? Write in the comments where you're watching from.